And good evening, everyone. You should be hearing me here at the new long-term planning webinar. My name is Francis Wade, and I'm with Framework Consulting. We're one of the hosts of the activity tonight. And tonight, as you probably know, we have three very special guests, Kristine Thompson, Douglas Orane, and we also have Graham Robinson. Three CEOs, one former CEO and two current CEOs. We're going to help us look at the whole issue of connecting the short term with the long term when it comes to planning. Because as you know, the very difficult times that we're in with respect to COVID, the lockdown, working from home, have made a tremendous impact on the way we are doing our work today and even thinking about the future in terms of strategy. And our panelists tonight are going to help us to examine the question, and I'm going to just jump right into some of the preliminaries. In terms of logistics for tonight, we're going to be working in two sessions. Session one, or part one, is going to be a panel discussion in which each of our invitees or presenters will be presenting a case, and we'll be discussing that case. And in the second part, we'll be asking them questions in this format. We're going to switch to a different room, come back in, ask them questions, and then go out into conference mode where we'll be asking even more deeper questions one-on-one with them if you want, because you can track them down and actually ask them questions on our platform. And you'll also be having conversations with other colleagues that you may have who will also be attending, who are attending the session. So those are the two parts for the evening. First part goes for 70 minutes, second part goes for 45 minutes. But let me just make sure that you're actually out there. I'm not just talking to myself. So if you're there, put something in the chat so that I can see that you are alive and you are hearing me. Hi, Denise, Derek Lockpat, all sorts of folks that I know and I also don't know. And Donna, welcome everyone. Okay, so a word from our sponsor this evening, Caribbean Compensation Report is coming out. It's being sponsored by or offered by Mark Rim Human Capital Consulting. That's a firm that is under here at Caribbean HR Forum. We're very grateful for them. And they're offering a report based on the last couple of years, 2018 to 19. Is that you grab a copy of that report at the URL that you'll see coming up on the screen. I'm going to ask someone to put that URL in the chat. If you can just go ahead and visit that website, you'll be able to download a compensation report covering the last 2 years. Really important stuff as we go ahead and deal with all of the impacts of COVID and downsizing and all the rest of it. So they're making this report available to us immediately for immediate download. Don't miss it, okay? All right. I also want to let you know about Caribbean HR Forum Virtual Conference, which is going to be launched on September 17th and 19th. That's one of the sponsors for tonight's evening. That's one of the brands that we have here at Framework Consulting. And finally, I want to let you know about a download that I've made available. This download it compiles some of the articles I've written for the Jamaica Gleaner on the topic of strategy and strategy execution. So make sure you grab a copy of that download. And I believe that's the last bit of business before we start off this evening. The ideas for tonight were inspired by the winners of the low touch economy, an article that was written by a company called the Board of Innovation. And basically they say that there's 15% of companies that are winners from the current crisis that we're going through, and the rest are not winners. In other words, the rest are losers. It's not good news, but what I want to know, so this is a question for you, if you are in our participant group tonight, or if you're on YouTube watching, what kind of recovery are you seeing in your country? What are you expecting is going to happen next? Is it going to be a U-shaped recovery like Home Depot, a V-shaped recovery like Netflix, or an L-shaped recovery like Royal Caribbean? Which one are you expecting? Go ahead and type that in the chat. And also list the name of your company. I'm sorry, your country. I forgot, not your company, your country. Great. U-shaped Denise. I think Denise is in Kristine is in Trinidad. Denise is in St. Lucia. Sean is in Antigua. Great. Just keep listing those out, and I'll keep going. And to say that the economy's our future has been definitely impacted by the economic disruption, the behavior shifts, and the change in measures that have been brought in to affect our health. A great low touch business, as defined by this report, is one that will have very few low touch interactions. I'm sorry, very many low touch interactions. High touch interactions are one in which you can see someone face to face. Low touch means that there's a separation, means that there's distance. So a company that is a great low touch business in the future is going to be based on low touch interaction. They'll have figured out how to operate with restrictions, all the restrictions that have come upon us as a result of COVID. They'll know how to limit access to vulnerable groups like the elderly and groups that must usually meet in large numbers. They'll know how to navigate the economic aftershocks, but more importantly, they'll know how to craft what are called white space opportunities. So what does that mean? We'll talk about that in just a minute. So the impact, as I said, has been, for 85% of companies, has been negative. And the negative impact is mostly focused on an instant drop in demand. And there's two kinds of drops in demand I want to focus on having you think about this evening. One is the demand that's still there. So in other words, I'll explain what it means in a minute. But in other words, you believe that your market still exists, that the unmet needs that you used to meet before still continue. And the second is that you believe that the demand has gone. So, okay, so here's a challenge for you. Which industries are examples of type 1 or type 2? Type 1, where you believe the demand is still there, there's still unmet needs. And type 2, where you believe that demand is gone it's either gone for temporarily or gone for the foreseeable future or gone forever. So with that tough question, I want you to just type in the chat an industry and whether you think it's a type 1 or a type 2. Let's get this discussion going. Industrial relations, type 1. Yeah, it's probably gone up or increased since then. Great. Let's get a couple more up. Just keep typing away. Type 2. I want an example of a type 2 where the demand has disappeared. Manufacturing, great. Richard Cole says hospitality, gone or going. Cruise, type 1. It still needs to continue, but temporarily gone. Type 2, travel, great. Just keep answering. I'm going to move ahead and talk about each one. So if the underlying demand is still there, what the article recommends is that the way you can stay focused on the future, because you must focus on the future in order to have a future. So if you're a type 1 company, the article focuses on what's called the jobs to be done framework. And I happened to write an article on that idea back in 2016. It's listed here on the Jamaica Gleaner. And I talked about the fact that the jobs to be done framework is all about people hiring different solutions to satisfy a need that they have. So a patio or a roti, for example, plays a very different job in Jamaica or Trinidad than it does if you're living in New York. No, I'm going to ask you if you can figure that out to put in the answer. Why is that different in the chat? It's a deep question. Okay, and in this type 2, when the demand is gone, I actually wrote an article that could help you think about that. It came out just last week. So kickstarting your digital transformation and where the white space might be in your industry. If you're selling a product, the white space might be around the service, the relationship, or the transformation that exists. So wherever your company focuses, there may be white spaces in the adjacent offerings that lie just beside the ones that your company is currently offering. Okay. So type 1 and type 2, according to this very startling report, the low touch report, these are mega trends that are reshaping the economies around the world. And think about the long term and the short term. You've got to balance the need to stay in business today and take care of your cash flow with a view to, am I going to have a business in 5 years, in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? And you've got to compensate for these trends. So tonight is all about balancing short-term and long-term planning. And I'm going to invite Douglas to come up. Douglas, could you turn on your camera and join us here and take us through one of the absolute best business cases of long-term planning that the Caribbean has ever seen. Douglas, are you there? Great. I'm going to turn off my microphone and turn off my camera.
Thank you, everybody. It sounds very silent. I hope you're hearing me. And if you're not, I know that Francis will let me know either online through Remo or by WhatsApp. He's been WhatsApping me constantly for the last 3 days. Great to have you all here. By the way, Francis, where is my timer? You and I are productivity missionaries, and time is important. So reminding you to put it up because I have 8 minutes to go. Okay, I'm going to set the scenario. I retired as chairman and CEO of Grace Kennedy, as CEO in 2011, as chairman 2014. So I've been out of the corporate world now since then. In 1981, I joined Grace Kennedy. It was a very, very different a time in the history of our country and also of me. I was in my mid-30s at the time. I worked my way up and I became the CEO in 1995. But what a time to become CEO, because Jamaica was in turmoil. There was severe adversity. The standard of living of our people generally hadn't increased in the last 10 years. And that was true of the people in Grace Kennedy as well. And I'll give you an example of what was happening. In Grace Kennedy, we would give salary increases at the beginning of the year of 20%. And by the end of the year, inflation was 40%. So it was like running up or down escalator. When I became CEO in 95, I said, we can't continue this way. We need to find a different way to function. And as a result of that, I said, what can we do? We got together, the senior management and the directors, and we came up with what we call the 2020 vision, what we wanted Grace Kennedy to look like in the year 2020. And I laid it out in a business conference at 300 of our people in January 96 in the conference center. And this is what I actually said at the time to the folks who were there. What we needed to do is to focus on an overarching objective. And the objective was to become a global consumer group which satisfied the needs of our consumers that were unmet at the time, and move from being a domestically oriented conglomerate based in Jamaica. And at the same time, keeping our values of grace we care, caring about not only our customers, but our staff and our community, which is one of the defining elements of our company. We came up with 4 drivers. 1, develop our people. 2, move closer to the final consumer. 3, grow international businesses. 4, achieve operational excellence. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. People, what did we focus on? Continuity of leadership. In other words, if somebody didn't perform or they left, migrated, we had 3 other people available to move into that slot. Consumer, how did we get closer to the consumer? Own and build our own brands. If you go to the Grace Kennedy website, you'll see about 15 or 20 different brands. They're owned by us and we use them worldwide now. International. What did we do differently? Instead of thinking of Jamaica as a country of 2.5 million people, we thought of Jamaica as 4.5 million people. 2.5 million here and 2 million in the Jamaican diaspora. But here is the good news. The 2 million per capita earn 8 times as much as the Jamaicans here in Jamaica. So when we looked at that market, we said, well, this is incredible. It's a huge market. And then we could double that, because if we included English-speaking Caribbeans from the islands that surround us, both in here in the Caribbean, but also in the diaspora in North America and Europe. Then we ended up with a population of about 9 million English-speaking Caribbean people to service. Operational excellence. We set a goal, double the productivity of every employee from Ralph to Rupert by the year 2000, in 5 years' time. Who was Ralph? The chairman of the board at the time. My boss, executive chairman. Who was Rupert? He was one of the messengers. And people said, it's crazy. You don't know, us Jamaicans lazy. I said, that's absolute nonsense. I don't believe that. What we need is to engage our people. Folks, it worked. We actually doubled productivity in 5 years. And people couldn't believe it. They said, how did you do it? Well, the way we did it is as follows. We shared what we're doing with every single individual in the company. But in addition to that, we said it benefits you because your standard of living is going to increase when we do this. In other words, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so I'm going to give you some base numbers as to where we were in 1995. And then I really want to ask for some questions. And I'll tell you the kind of question I'm going to ask in about a minute. In 1995, our revenues were about 300 million US dollars. Our profit after tax was about 10 million US dollars. Our market value was 36 million US dollars. And our PE ratio on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, wait for this number, was 3.4. So that's almost unheard of, but it shows you how turbulent the environment was in Jamaica at this time. And therefore, it's not unlike what we face today. It's also a different type of turbulence, and we got through it. So here's my question to you. Having got up on that platform at the business conference and laid out what I just said, what if you were Douglas Orane, would you do next as the group CEO at that time in order to execute on what I just said? What would be the top priority that you would give? I'm going to give you a couple questions that were asked of me when I sat down at the business conference. The first question, I'll never forget it. A manager got up, he says, well, Doug, that's all well and good, but isn't 25 years too far into the future to plan? I said, no, but I'd like to hear how you would answer that one. And then the other one was people said, you have laid out so many things. Which one are we to focus on? So, folks, you are Douglas Orane. It's 1996, January. Francis may have a photograph of me at the time that he can put up if he looks at the photos I sent him earlier. And what would you do next? And I'd like to hear what your questions or answers would be on that topic. Francis?
Great, thanks, Douglas. I'm going to invite Kristine and Graham to join us so that we can discuss the very interesting case of the 25-year goals that GK set. So here's Graham and Kristine. Let's see if we get her up. All right, we'll go ahead and wait for Kristine in the meantime. Graham, questions and comments for Douglas.
Well, I think it was supremely inspirational, quite frankly. And as someone who grew up in Jamaica and has observed it from afar, it's certainly something which, that transformation that took place and which Douglas led is one for the textbooks and one which I think everyone who has been a student afterwards seeks to emulate. And I think the four areas that he has described, whether in terms of people, consumer, the need to go international, and operational excellence, are really key things for businesses, whether in consumer or otherwise, to focus on. I think probably my question for Douglas is, you lay out a 25-year plan, and I know it's a question that you posed also, but is, as you went through it, how did you manage the inevitable of balancing the near term and the short and the long term? to keep the vision on the 25-year plan, yet at the same time, the focus on the near-term objectives of hitting the monthly and quarterly goals, which I think is a challenge that is the perennial challenge that executives have in this position.
Okay, shall I answer, Francis?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, the answer to what to do first was to double productivity by every means we could find. What's the reason? If we didn't, we would have been dead. We'd have been out of business. Most people may not realize it unless they're around my age, but most of the competitors we had directly at that time no longer exist. So the first thing to do was to get everybody up to speed, and people really engage in that because they could see the results within literally weeks and months. One of the things is we're very particular about punctuality in Grace Kennedy. You notice I finished a minute early of my 8 minutes. Well, that's part of the training we had in order not to waste time. That's one way that we did it, by emphasizing punctuality. But we looked at all different methods we could find, and also our critical workers, the people who make the difference. For example, the people who are on the factory lines, who mix the ingredients, the people who do quality assurance. At the time we were in the maritime industry, the crane drivers. They're the key people, and very often we miss focusing on them. That's why one of my hobbies is to walk around and just rap with everybody I can find in the factory or in the supermarket or wherever. The second one that was critically important was to own our own brands. At the time, Grace Kennedy did not own the Grace brand worldwide because of a series of events over the previous decades. So one of the things we focus on is by 1997, we bought the Grace own brand rights, intellectual property rights worldwide, so that we could build on a platform that we own. And so we launched the Grace brand, relaunched the Grace brand with a theme, New Face of Grace in 97. And we have been building on that ever since. We now export to over 30 countries. But you have no idea how proud our Jamaican employees were to see our products going out to all these different countries. And it continues today that we get that response. So there are simple things that leaders can do to get followers to follow. But the most important thing is to put yourself in their shoes and say what's most important to them. No, you could say, well, 25 years is a long time. Yeah, when he asked me that question, of course it is. But it's like sailing a ship. You have a vision. You want to get across the ocean. You may not know exactly where you're going to end up, but you know the general direction, and you change course as events change. So later on, I'm going to give you some examples of where we are today as of 2020, which here we are 25 years later. And it's not me executing on the 2020 vision. It's my successor, Don Webby. And that's why succession planning, training the younger generation to get engaged early is so critical. It's essential for effective execution of your strategies over the long term. Long answer for a short question.
That's great. All right. I'm gonna drop off the stage, and Douglas, if you and Graham can turn off your mic and turn off your camera, and we'll give Kristine the stage to talk about Chuck E. Cheese. So Kristine Thompson is from Trinidad, and she's the CEO of Cabo St. Lucia, the former CEO of Sunshine Snacks, and she's also the founder of the Chuck E. Cheese franchise in Trinidad. So she's going to be focusing on, she's been CEO of she's been a top person in many, many companies, and she's going to be sharing with us the challenges of Chuck E. Cheese.
Thank you, Francis, and good evening, everyone. I hope you're hearing me. I guess you'll let me know if you're not. Douglas, let me just say that, my real admiration of Grace Kennedy's achievement is really building the power of that brand, because I have a real passion in some of the industries that I've been in in terms of brand. And I am from Trinidad. I've grown up here, but my mother's actually Jamaican. And I remember being a little girl in our kitchen, and she would buy Grace coconut milk or Grace pigeon peas or something. And she'd always say, but what a great way Grace tastes. And that was a line that was part of my upbringing. And to have a tagline that was so inculcated, and I think that brand comes with so much positive emotion. And I think when you get that connection to a brand in the household, at the level of household, you know, you're far and away ahead of the game. So great respect. I picked Chuck E. Cheese because its challenge is real. Chuck E. Cheese is a kids entertainment concept. I'm not sure how many of you would be aware of it, but it's basically a sort of arcade type concept for kids ages 2 to 12 generally, and there's also it's famous for its pizza, so restaurants and entertainment. As you can imagine, this is one of the industries, and this is why I picked it, that I would describe the effect of COVID as catastrophic. The fundamentals of this business are basically social gathering. It's getting kids together. For example, birthday parties are a big part of our business. And it's definitely in the area of discretionary spend. So from the time people lose their jobs, there's uncertainty about economic futures. The first thing, of course, they're going to cut out is entertainment. However, someone in the chat said, I still believe that entertainment and social interaction among kids in particular remains one of those, you know, Haslow needs that is going to is universal and is lasting. The question is how we do that. So our doors were closed from mid-March to mid-June, and upon reopening, we were probably 85% down, gradually recovered each week. And then Trinidad and Tobago has had a fabulous record of COVID management as of last week. That started to unravel a little bit, and we started community spread very clearly. And what we're finding is that fear is trumping any proposition. We have a deal right now where people can come and buy play packages and get free pizza, and we're still having a challenge driving foot traffic just because you're dealing with that emotion of parents being just absolutely, you know, scared of what's going on. However, I think, as in any crisis, the key is to focus on core brand principles. And I think Grace would understand that really clearly. Number one, we have to stay very close to our consumers. So we would survey our guests on a regular basis to say, okay, how are you feeling? What's the sentiment like? What's worrying you? What's not? What would make you more likely to come in? And I think that's really clear. That's really important to keep on top of that. We put out a safety video. So completely new operating protocols, the temperature testing, the sanitizing, the every other table being marked off, every other game being cordoned off, and having that cleanliness and constant sanitization being very visible to the guest. Because what you want in this environment is that this brand now stands out as that trusted safety, best practice type operation, because that's what's going to allow us to win. We always said at Chuck E. Cheese, focus on what's inside those four walls. We can only really execute on what we can control and do that the best you can, and kind of basically forget about what's happening on the outside that's not controllable. We also went into, well, of course, continuing a social media presence, staying relevant, staying connected to the consumer. Again, that relationship that is so key. And we started to produce branded pizza and sold it into supermarkets, which was never done before. Apart from, you know, making a little extra change on the cash flow on the pizza, it was more about keeping the brand top of mind into the kitchens of parents and families in the island. Next slide, Francis. So of course we have you know, some real short-term imperatives that have to be the major focus of what we do. Number one, as again, focus on brand. What we say, pump up the magic. Let people come in our door and just have, you know, the most mind-blowing experience that they could possibly get. Operational excellence in this time is key. as I said, some simple operating protocols, which is just, pretty familiar to all of us. Very importantly, restructuring of the P&L. We, I think, in a fairly unprecedented way, converted almost all our costs to variable costs, percentage of revenue, including our rent, our common area maintenance charges, which is something that was very, not very common in the market. So we are now at a percentage of revenue. If I sell $100,000, if I sell $1 million, I'm going to pay rent based on that performance. And that is key for us to survive. Business school day course 101, cash is king. Razor sharp focus on cash flow management. So putting payables on a plan, haircuts where available, moratoriums on debt service, shoring up the excess liquidity we need to ride the wave. And of course, just basically trying to manage every single cent that goes out of the door. Marketing, real focus on value. We need to look at the customer proposition and what's working for them. And then, however, must keep a focus, a very keen eye on the long term. Next slide, please, Francis. So what does that mean? Basically, you have a shrinking, let's assume that we have a shrinking market. What we want to do is to dominate, get more share, and basically drive the competitor or any other competitor out of the market. How do we do that? We launched a unique concept called All You Can Play, where it's a technology-driven solution, which is very difficult to keep that CapEx going in this time. But we got to keep focusing on what's unique and differentiable. So now you can do sort of an all-inclusive concept. And a real pain point for the customer was, how much am I going to spend? How much are these kids going to, drain out of my wallet? And having that all-inclusive concept, just like a sandals concept, took that stress away from, what was going to be the bill at the end of the day, which of course in this time is a key focus of parents. Diversifying to new markets. Yes, we didn't have the capital to now go into Jamaica and Suriname, but we were able to shore up letters of intent so that when the time is right, we can move on that. Other ways to add value to your business, new channels, adjacent industries, use of technology to basically build loyalty programs and get more, basically the flywheel off of your communication program with your customers. And then finally, strategically drive your cost structure down. So where things that might have been more difficult in the short term become very important in the long term. For example, shrinking your footprint. This is no longer 14,000 square foot store. It's probably more like a 10,000, etc. And really using that time to strategically change how we compete. I know I'm out of time. Happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Kristine. I'm going to invite Douglas and Graham to join me. But before that, a question I have is that you're a classical touch type business, or you've been high touch and you now need to transition to being low touch. Do you think, as you look at the trajectory of business, of revenue, that eventually your revenue will exceed your fixed costs? Do you think that you'll win in 5 years' time if, for example, we're still distancing and no vaccine is found? Or do they have to find a vaccine for you to be profitable at some point? Tough question, I know.
Tough question. I think we can break even without a vaccine, but I think the profitability in a real sense comes back with a vaccine.
Right.
It's just one of those industries.
Right, because the vaccine would allow the children to interact with each other in a high touch way, correct?
Correct. Unless people just get very accustomed to it and we have some sort of herd immunity, etc. So.
Right. Wow. So there's probably, I've asked this question of other strategic planning groups. What year do you expect a vaccine to come in? And not asking you in particular, but this is one I asked rhetorically, but I asked them, is it 2 years from now? And how does the plan pivot around that date? And in our case, it wouldn't be the date that a vaccine is ready, but the date that a vaccine is actually put into our bodies here in the Caribbean, which is not the same as it being available. So I've asked the question several times, but anyway, let me turn it over to Douglas and Graham. Comments, questions?
Okay, can I go first? Are you hearing me, Kristine?
I
okay,
am.
Well, first, I agree with you. All costs can be made variable. People who say, yeah, but I have fixed costs. Well, listen, if you go out of business, you'll learn pretty soon those fixed costs become variable because they don't exist
Correct.
anymore. So you're absolutely right to look at all your costs in that way. And that's very innovative. I've noticed in Kingston, there's a company, I think it might actually be Devon House Ice Cream, I'm not sure, but they have vans going around since COVID-19 lockdown started, reminding me of my childhood, playing all these nursery rhymes and offering ice cream for sale, which I think is a fantastic idea. And anybody I know under 12 years old wants to go and buy something on the road from them. So it's a way they have moved their business away from a central location to basically covering the entire city. Is there a parallel in that for your business? I don't know your business well enough.
For sure. We so the mouse is the major mascot and key part of the branding. So we started taking the mouse out to homes and having birthday parties in people's homes. You know, I see the potential for putting a bunch of games, you know, maybe it's only 10, 12 games, maybe it's 20% of the offering on a 40-foot container and sort of moving around to maybe smaller groups of people. But I think it's the time to blow everything out. I mean, the international CEO, new international CEO, has a Warner Brothers background, and he is now focusing on the whole idea of animation and you know, merchandise and sort of commercializing the character itself. So an uncertain road ahead, but not without some possibilities.
Great. There's a question from Sean. How was rent as a percentage of revenue negotiated with the landlords? We're all interested in that one.
Pretty simply, we are an anchor tenant in most malls and most real estate developments. We would drive a lot of traffic, and it's also the kind of traffic that's attractive, you know, middle income families, etc. And it was this is necessary for our survival. So if we don't get this, we relocate. Thank you very much. Of course, it was very difficult for us to relocate because we sort of invested a lot in that location, but I think the strength of the brand really helps that negotiation, and the traffic that the brand drives to that particular location as well, the commercial energy. No landlord wants to lose Chuck E. Cheese. Plus, it doesn't help, or does help, that we have quite a bit of space, so the absolute rental number is meaningful. But I think this is the time, it's happening all over the US, to drive different negotiations and different contractual structures than we've ever seen before.
Great. Okay, with that, we'll switch over. Thank you, Kristine. We'll hear from Graham. So guys, as you're listening, I'm speaking to the audience, or participants, remember that you queue up your questions, because when we come back into the Q&A, we're going to have an in-depth discussion. So this is just the tip of the iceberg with respect to what we can learn from the three CEOs that we have. Okay, so Douglas and Kristine, if you can turn off your mic and your camera, and I'll do the same, and we'll give Graham the floor. So Graham Robinson is the global president of Stanley Black Decker. Those are two hardware tools if you're a hardware kind of person. Home Depot, or get the brands in Jamaica, True Value, and he's also the former president of Honeywell Industrial Safety. And he's also ex-Campionite, which we won't hold against him if you're here in Jamaica. Graham, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, Douglas, Kristine, and distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. It's truly a pleasure to be here on this forum and panel today. A recent survey by McKinsey indicated that between the years 2001 to 2014, companies that embraced long-term growth strategies, like Douglas articulated with grace, grew revenue by 47% more, grew earnings 36% more, and had 7 billion more in market cap than companies that embraced short-term growth strategies. Yet at the same time, over 66% of the executives surveyed indicated that the pressure in the last 5 years was significantly more to drive short-term earnings. And as a company and as an executive at a company that announced its earnings today, I can attest to the fact that that pressure is in fact real. So if the evidence for long-term growth is so strong, why are so many companies myopically focused on making the quarter strategy? Why aren't companies attempting to do both? I would postulate that there are two key reasons. One is it is hard. It is bloody hard and requires an analytical and intellectual rigor that not everyone is willing to dedicate. Number two, we have convinced ourselves that planning for growth today and tomorrow are mutually exclusive, and that the only way we invest in long-term growth is by sacrificing short-term growth. And as leaders, we must do both. And I recall what my previous ex-chairman at Honeywell said, which is the most significant job of a leader and the most important job is to do two seemingly inconceivable or two seemingly conflicting things at the same time. So in the next 5 minutes, I will describe how I've gone about planning for today, tomorrow, and the future in the business that I started to lead at Stanley Black Decker 120 days ago, after starting at Stanley Black Decker only 120 days ago. So 16 weeks ago, I started at Stanley Black Decker in what can only be described as challenging times. We had depressed end markets with our end markets down 30 to 50%. I started remotely, I worked remotely, and I never met anyone on my team. And to this day, I have not met anyone on my team. I was leading and forming a new division, the industrial division. So I had two objectives. One, which was meeting our near-term constraints, which is the quarter. And then secondly, planting the seeds for long-term growth. So in my first 100 days, I focused on three key elements. The first, establishing an intellectual and analytical rigor and communicating that clearly throughout the organization to all the general managers. And at the same time, put in place a plan for today, tomorrow, and the future. And as you can imagine, that plan had three elements. The first element for today focused on really utilizing the 80-20 principle, or the Pareto principle, which discovered in the 19th century by Alfred Pareto, is as relevant today as any point in time, and probably one of the more illuminating ways to drive value in an organization by focusing on that 80%, which is driven from the 20%. The second element in terms of planning for tomorrow was focused on driving growth in adjacencies and innovation. With significant exposure to the end markets of oil and gas, aerospace, and automotive, it was critical that we pivot and pivot quickly to new end markets. And for the future, the third element was about transforming the business from a products-based business to a services, solutions, and recurrent-based business, and really forming and starting the Stanley Industrial Services division, which I did. So with a clear plan of what we do today, tomorrow, and the future, and a clear articulation as to the need for intellectual rigor to get there, the second task is aligning the organization to get there. And in that context, it was critical to transform the organization for cost and growth. Again, the two seemingly conflicting things at the same time. And to do that, I did three things. One was maximizing the span for each manager and reducing the number of layers. And this is a tried and true principle in terms of spans and layers. But at this particular time with COVID-19, it is no more relevant than any time before. Because if I can start and run a $3 billion business without meeting anyone on my team face to face, the traditional boundaries have been broken down, and the traditional spans and layers have been flattened and allows you to do things differently. The second was a ruthless focus on 80-20 prioritization. What was important? What is important? Focusing on the critical few. And the third is using more functions to drive growth. And for those that are part of a matrix organization or a functional organization, this is another byproduct of COVID-19, where the importance of functions is never as critical as any time before. The third element was investing for growth, putting in place with the plan for today, tomorrow, and the future. It was critical to invest in the key areas, but also protect the growth in those key areas. And in my case, the key area to protect was engineering and putting in place centers of excellence in low-cost regions to get more from less from the engineering dollar. So in summary and conclusion, I really hope that the example I gave of planning for today, tomorrow, and the future, it is hard, but it is absolutely critical. And I'm hopeful that the comments I gave in terms of insisting on the intellectual rigor, explicitly planning for today, tomorrow, and the future, structuring the organization for cost and growth, and investing and protecting those investments. While the specifics may be different for your business, you can find equally as rewarding and illuminating. But if you don't believe me, lastly, I encourage you to remember the old Chinese proverb, which stated that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And the second best time is today. So go out and plant your tree. Thank you.
Great, Graham. I'm going to invite Kristine and Douglas to join us. And there's a question on the floor. Large companies do a lot of pandemic planning. And this is coming from, looks like Steve Miller, but over on YouTube, I think. And he says a company he was with did a lot of planning, pandemic planning after Ebola. How much war gaming? I guess this is geared towards all three of our panelists. How much war gaming did our companies doing prior to COVID? Did they do a scenario generation kind of what happens if this thing hits? Or has it been just a case of being caught unawares? Interesting question.
Well, I speak for the cases at Stanley Black Decker and at Honeywell, where I was running businesses before. Certainly, we're engaged in planning and scenario planning and thinking about potential alternatives for the future. We have a pretty sophisticated what we call strat process, which looks ahead the next 3 to 5 years and has scenarios for what takes place. But like most companies, predicting and reacting to something of this scale is at a different level than what we've seen before. And in this case, while there can be plans, the need for agility, the need for speed, the need to react in a manner which has been different before is as critical now as ever before. So while we certainly had plans before, those plans were accelerated. Those plans were revised in certain cases, and they were pivoted towards areas which drove near-term growth, and yet at the same time planted those seeds for long-term growth.
Great. And questions and comments from Douglas and Kristine on the case of Stanley Black Decker so far.
Well, Graham, can I ask you for a couple examples of how you have executed on the 80-20 principle with your team? And the reason why I find that people get all caught up in detail, and so what happens is they're not as productive as they could be. And one of the roles of leaders is to do that, but you have to have a certain self-discipline how do you pass on that skill to your team?
So that's a very, very good question. Thank you. So I said there are two things. One is on my 10th day, I set the expectations of what my expectations of general managers are. And I had 8 elements to that. And I carefully communicated that to the general managers and to the entire organization as to the need for prioritization, focus, a clear management operating system, and discipline in operations. So first, communicating the expectations. The second element, though, was really developing a bit of a framework, and I call it the 80-20 operating system, which really, because your point is absolutely right. It is very, very easy to get caught in the details without seeing the bigger picture. And without a framework to help to guide you through it, you're going to get into the weeds. And you're going to be at the 100-foot level and you don't see the 1,000-foot level. So one of the things which I did was put in place an operating system which really focuses on what are the key elements to look at. How do you go about assessing what's in that 20 and 80? How do you determine what's the 80% driving the 80% of revenue and your 20%? And don't boil the ocean. Don't try to solve everything at the same time. Focus on revenue first, then focus on margins, and then determine how that flows through the organization afterwards. So really being somewhat intentional in terms of what you do, but more importantly, what you don't do, and helping to guide that through the organization. Because at times like this, we all have to do more with less. And I found the framework to be a really powerful way of getting that, as long as you can focus the organization on what really are those key steps to start with. And I did that by focusing primarily on revenue first, in terms of the 80-20, and then the second step was OI, and then carefully eliminating those things which didn't add value in that context.
Graham, I have a question for you. I'm assuming that you report to a board of directors or some sort of shareholder group, right? And how supportive are they in practice of sacrifices to short-term performance and earnings? Because I found that to be a particular challenge. So if I meet with the board and I line out the R&D pipeline, we're going to, for example, in my time at Sunshine Snacks, we have a whole better for you line of snacks. We start to think about sustainable oils because, of course, all these Gen Z, talk about palm oil killing orangutans and so on. And then you start to talk about, the sunflower oils and so on. And it all is, nobody can disagree with that. But when the actual quarterly earnings are published or the accounts come out, there's a different type of discussion if there's not, 15% growth on the year before. Is you ever been sort of, subject to that kind of pressure to produce short-term results? I think it's a reality of corporate life to some extent.
Sure. I mean, it's the pressure you get every single day. And it doesn't go away. And it won't go away. But our job as leaders is to determine how to manage those two conflicting things. The need to get the short-term results and at the same time pivot the organization and plant the seeds for long-term growth. And what I've found effective in that regard is being very, very intentional on what you're doing and why you're doing it. So you're being intentional about having focus on what you're doing to maximize your short-term results, but at the same time being intentional about what you're doing to plant the seeds for tomorrow. Because the reality is that I've not met the board or the CEO or chairman who doesn't want to do both. Yet the pressures are such that they tend to focus myopically on just the quarter for whatever reasons, for the obvious reasons. But the necessity to have the planning in place from today and explicitly communicating how you're doing it, to say, this is being done to drive our near-term results. This is where I am intentionally carving out and planting the seeds for the future. And this is where I'm investing to drive growth. But doing it in a manner where you attempt to achieve both, where you attempt to optimize your cost structure at the same time, doing it in a manner which is intelligent and thoughtful to have those seeds that are necessary for the long run. And I don't portend that it's easy. I don't portend that. And I don't say it is trivial, but it is the challenging job that executives have, and the need to have the intellectual and analytical rigor to go through the data and to explicitly state how you're doing it and where you're doing it is really our job and really the opportunity that we have as executives.
Correct.
Does that mean I can ask another question here?
Where is our,
the hot seat?
Okay, well,
absolutely.
Well, this is a question I'm curious to know because you're based in the United States, but you're speaking with a Caribbean accent. So how do you motivate people who don't come from the same cultural background as yourself? And is that a plus or a minus? Because I could see as this exotic guy from the Caribbean who, you know, everybody who comes from the Caribbean is innovative, creative, self-motivated once we migrate. So maybe they say, hey, you know, Graham, this is a great guy to have as my leader. I'm curious to know.
Well, I tend to think about it as a plus, like I do most things, quite frankly. And I think it's an advantage. And yes, I'm from Jamaica and grew up in Jamaica, went to high school in Jamaica, and most of my family lives in Jamaica. But I spent time in the US. I lived and worked in Korea. My wife is Korean, and I have 3 ethnically confused children. So in that context, I would say that I have experienced a number and broad range of cultures which help me. And what I tend to do in most situations, like the ones that I experience in the organizations I've been in, and whether when I was in Korea working for Samsung and being the only non-Korean in that environment of tens of thousands of people at Samsung, and people coming up to you to touch your skin to see if it rubs off every day, or not every day, but occasionally, is really trying to find the areas where there are common ground and the areas in which you can identify with and where they can identify with you. And in general, I've probably developed a reputation for one which is focused on driving for results, someone who's intense and someone who is focused on getting the best from the teams and organization. And it's principled on hard work, like most people are coming from the Caribbean. And I found that to be an advantage in every single situation that I've been in, and never a liability. And I've found that putting emphasis on that and putting emphasis on those areas which are strengths and putting emphasis on communicating them clearly throughout the organization and trying to realize that I can relate in any way, shape, or form to each and every person in the organization allows me a manner, forces me a manner to bond and to establish a rapport with the team, which I've found to be successful in the organizations that I've been a part of here in the United States. Not sure if it answers you fully, but certainly been my experience.
Well, I think it does, and the fact that you have such a tremendous background of diversity in your own career, geographically and family-wise, makes a big difference. But there's something else. I'll just put it in at this point. Listening and watching, I feel you're a very humble person. So if I were one of your subordinates, I would trust you. And I share with people that that's one of the key qualities of leadership, that your subordinates trust you. And people are real smart. They have antennae out there that they can pick up when people are saying one thing, but they really mean another. And it's something that us leaders really need to think through, especially in this time of crisis, that we're honest with people and let them know exactly how we feel, what the options are, even if they're not rosy, and say, here's what we're going to come out of it. In other words, prepare for the worst, but hope for the best.
You're absolutely right. Well, on the latter part, I won't comment on the humility, but I certainly agree with you in terms of the need for complete transparency, especially at this juncture. Because the solutions and the decisions that we have to make as leaders at this point, you're kind of choosing between two bad options, which is the least worst option, quite frankly, especially when you're talking about affecting people's lives. And the need to, the point you raised, Kristine, in terms of balancing both the near term and the long term, and doing that in a manner where you preserve and maintain people's dignity, and at the same time chart what is best for the company, is certainly a challenge and the opportunity that we face on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Are you hearing me now?
Yep.
We are.
Yes,
Sure.
great. Okay, so we're about to move over to the next room, taking a short break at 7:15 or 8:15, depending on the time. The link, we've dropped the link a few times in the chat. There's two versions of it. There's bit.ly/3carbs-CEOs. The first question we're going to ask when we come back is from the floor. It's how do you convince your key stakeholders that planning 5 and 10 years into the future is absolutely the right thing to do, even in all these uncertain times? So guys, I'm going to throw that question at you when we come back at 15 minutes past the hour. So if you're listening, just click on that link that I've put up in the chat, and it'll take you to the new room. It'll open at 7:15 sharp, so it's just a few minutes time. So we're going to be booted out of this room in just a minute. Okay, guys, take care. See you over there. And here we go. Welcome back to the second part of our evening, the Q&A. Let's get everybody back up on stage. Great. Okay, so let me pop that first question in, and we'll give it some, because it's a question that we get asked in our strategic planning retreats, because we're all about 15 to 30 years old, and people get cross-eyed as soon as we say that. And we tell them about Grace Kennedy and Douglas, and they still get cross-eyed. But here's the question in the chat, and here's the question in the Q&A. Can you guys see that? How do you convince your key stakeholders that planning 5, 10 years into the future is absolutely the right thing to do, even in all these uncertain times?
Okay.
Question by Green Freckleton.
So when do you want us to answer that?
Right now.
Oh.
Is a good.
Okay. So is everybody hearing us? Whoever is on?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right. So here is one way I would suggest to do it. In each stage in my career, especially as I got older, and certainly when I launched the 2020 vision, I had an idea of where I personally wanted to be in 5, 10, or 15 years' time. The question to ask each person is, have you developed your own personal long-term plan? So first of all, do you know where you want to be in your career in 5, 10, 15 years' time? And most importantly, when you retire, so you don't say to people at age 59, I don't know where to live and I'm retired next year and I don't have a pension. These are really fundamental issues that individuals need to think through. Because if you have that plan, you can do something else that's very important. You can say, how does that plan fit with my company's strategy? Because especially in later years, people would come to me and say, Doug or Mr. Orane, this is what I want to do with my life. Does it fit in with Grace Kennedy? And it allowed us to have a candid conversation about, yes, it would or not. But the reality is, even if it doesn't fit in within the next year or 2 or 3 or 5, they would be developing the experience and creating value for our company that would benefit them when they go to the next stage in their lives. So they may want to start their own business. They may want to migrate. They may want to go into academia and teach. Who knows? But have your own personal plan. Don't depend solely on your boss to develop your personal long-term plan for you. So get out a piece of paper now, and as soon as this webinar is finished, start writing down where you want to be in the year 2030.
Francis, the other thing I would say is that, talking about a 5 or 10-year plan can be very sort of abstract for a lot of people. But I think our role as leaders is to create a vision in their mind that this is in the mind of the people, the organization that you're leading, about what might we look like in 10 years in a way that is much more tangible. So for example, let's just say in the Grace case, it might be that you could buy a Grace product in every street corner in New York City, for example, or something that is easier to touch or feel or understand. And then you get them excited behind a vision, a new state, an evolved sense of being, and then your strategic plan, is really the nuts and bolts behind that. But I think you have to have an end game or an end point that is somewhere people want to be.
Yeah, I agree with both, and particularly illuminating. I'd probably say the way in which I've gone about it is by soliciting and engaging to get buy-in throughout the organization. Because in the organizations that I've been a part of, they're comprised of divisions, which comprises of businesses, which comprises of functions, which comprises of operations. So the key activity for me is to make the planning process not just a top-down process, but a bottoms-up process. But getting individuals to start to plan for their particular area. Because not everyone can plan for an entire large company, such as a Stanley Black Decker, but they can plan for what's important for them. So doing the both, getting the bottoms-up planning, the top-down vision, and once you're finished and having that comprehensive plan, articulating what it means for them. What it means for them, whether personally or what it means for their business, and trying to be as clear and succinct as possible in that regard. And in some of the businesses I've been part of, we've used something called the X Matrix, or other organizations have used it for lead management, to really take a long-term aspirational vision to something which is tangible to businesses or operations that they can really act on, and thereby generating much more buying.
I would add also that the companies that we've done these 15, 20-year futures with benefited because we forced them to look beyond the horizon over to what would happen as a result of their intentions, not just what was predicted, but what future they actually wanted. And in many cases, what COVID has done is to just basically bite 5 years out of their 15-year plan. So now it's a 10-year plan, because what people are saying is that more change has happened in the last 6 months than happened in the last 10 years or the last 15 years. So what they've benefited from is having an acceleration of the plan that they had, because it's an unintended, unplanned surprise acceleration, but it actually, the discipline of creating this 15, 20-year plan meant that they'd already thought through the future. They already thought through what a digital transformation would look like. They didn't anticipate it happening this fast, as I said. But now all they need to do is just leapfrog and put in place the plan that they had for 2025 this year. So by having that detailed plan, they're able to not flounder, but actually just kind of go in there and jump. And that's one of the benefits. Any other comments or responses?
Well,
add to that before
I would just amplify what you said in two dimensions. One is, while I was at Honeywell, you came, so probably about 2 years ago, and did that exact session with us in terms of long-term planning, and really took us from the comfort zone of the 5-year strategic plan to the 20-year, which proved to be particularly beneficial. The second thing, though, is when I joined Samsung in Korea, I joined a group called the Global Strategy Group, which gave advice to the executives. And we started developing a 5-year plan, and I thought that was so great. And then they came back and said, oh, well, what we normally do is a 100-year plan at Samsung. So I said, okay, well, I mean, not sure I'm ready to step there. But that's what they did when they started Samsung. And if you look at the plan they developed then, it's actually pretty eerily similar to where they're going as a company. So I think your point of really going outside of the comfort zone is a really, really good one.
Well, okay. The next question is from Kyle Stewart. How do you address the concerns around job security in these uncertain times? I feel employees' anxiety levels are heightened and it affects their productivity.
Well, I'm retired, so I'll wait for the other two who are active on the front line, and then I'll give my thoughts.
That's a pun.
You know, what we tried to do at Chucky was retain as many jobs. We pretty much retained all jobs except we put everybody on much reduced hours. So that, you know, at least they got something, not nothing, and people weren't completely on the breadline. The reality is that you can't give any promises, and you basically have to say, you know, we're all in this together and we're working hard, all of us, to secure the best possible outcome, but very difficult times to give any sense of job security.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's where you have two bad options in choosing the least worst. The thing you have to do is to be pretty transparent about the situation that you're in. You know, at Stanley Black Decker, when I started 3 months ago, or 3.5 months ago, we started with reduced work weeks and furloughs as a way of preserving as many jobs as possible. Today, we announced with our earnings that we are taking a step back and moving more towards permanent cuts as the COVID-19 situation gets deeper. But what we did and what we continue to do is to be very, very transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and the criticality of it in terms of preserving the long-term stability of the company, of which it benefits everyone, because there's no point in having a great company which doesn't exist if we don't adjust the cost structure in a timely manner. So being transparent, being honest, and being clear as to what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think are probably the best things you can do in these circumstances.
Here's what I would suggest. Always find a way to be marketable for the next set of jobs in the future. So in this turmoil, what I would do is to find ways to educate myself, use whatever resources are available to develop new skills, from technological skills like in the digital world to soft skills like how to cope with anxiety and stress, so that no matter what gets thrown at me, I'm able to come through and survive and thrive, because you can't guarantee that your job will be there. And I see this as a big opportunity in the digital field. Look, there's so much. I spend a lot of my time talking to fifth and sixth formers, and I'm amazed how few of them in Jamaica are using podcasts and other educational sources to educate themselves, to learn the sciences, maths, foreign languages, history, geography, which will give them an advantage, not only in the world of work, but self-satisfaction and the ability to create new businesses for themselves. And so that's one of the things I think we need to encourage folks to do. Jamaica has one of the highest penetrations of cell phones in the world. It's 110%. That means that more people generally have more than one cell phone, smartphone. So let's use it as individuals at every level to educate ourselves for the future. That's what I am doing. I never knew how to do virtual meetings until 3 months ago, but I tell you, they're a lot more productive than driving for an hour and 20 minutes and getting irritated in traffic and sitting down with a bunch of people and then heading back again. So there's actually been a big increase in my productivity and others. And there's one other advantage, I would say. It gives us the opportunity to more closely bond as families, because in crises like this, having myself studied how other eras, like going back to the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague. How did people get through it? It's families that pull through together. It's not individuals alone. And this is a way to rediscover the power of families helping each other to get through this period.
Yeah,
the other thing I would say is that I recently attended a Harvard Business School seminar on new ventures that were sort of hot, having a lot of potential post-COVID. And when you listen to, for example, one whole sub-segment being networked industry. So for example, like a Pinterest, right, which would start with, you know, interest boards and then just become this massive networked, scaled up business. And when you think of it, you used to have a lot of capital and a lot of human resources and being situated in a first world country to start these type of businesses. Why can't somebody from a desk in the Caribbean start one of these? It's almost as if the barriers are lower in some instances, and easier to get involved in some of these global businesses than it was in the past.
It's true. There's a friend of mine, Lloyd Carney. He's an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. He said WhatsApp could have been invented in Jamaica by 4 young graduates from UTech or UE, because he knows the 4 people who invented WhatsApp in San Francisco. And they're not techies, they aren't geniuses, but they just spotted an unmet need, which is that a lot of people wanted to get free text messages worldwide. And ironically, Jamaica was one of the first early adopters of WhatsApp, because the demand was so great. So it could have been us, you're right. So let's see how we get the next one to do it. But you require certain ingredients in order to generate, to move from new ideas to successful startups, because you need the ideas and you need a group of people who are supportive of young people and don't discourage them and say, why are you idiot, man? Why are you talking about? You know, that kind of, we have to cut out that nonsense of how we speak to the younger generation. And then you need a supporting group of angel investors, venture capitalists, mezzanine investors who will carry businesses through to the point where they can list on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. And I believe in Jamaica, we're very close to that in terms of creating that ecosystem. One of the reasons is because I participate in it myself. By the way, that's one of the advantages of retiring early. I don't have the time to do that. And also it gives the younger generation the opportunity to spread their wings and carry us further at a faster rate. I'll keep quiet at this point.
I think the 3 of us.
Just one comment in terms of our lobbying to our governments. You know, when you look at the trend in Trinidad and Tobago, there's been a rise in the percentage of subsidies and transfers going to the population, and a decline in the percentage of the population that is being employed. And we you know, the more that we give and transfer, is the less people really have to, you know, have the necessity be the mother invention. You know, we can't have that happen. So right, we all have a role to play in that.
Right. Along those lines, to answer the question about what can companies do to handle the anxiety, I remember being really impressed by one company that was about to do layoffs. And they had their HR coordinate essentially job training for people who needed to find work outside of the company. So people who were being laid off, they thought far enough ahead that they said, okay, here are the skills that they're going to need in the open market. And they started to train them. They said they need financial planning skills. So they started to provide them. They needed resume writing skills, but then nobody had anything to do with LinkedIn. This is a few years ago, but people were anxious, not only because they're losing their job, but because their skills from their perception weren't valuable on the open market and they didn't know how to find a job, just the basics. So this company put in place this whole capacity building for employees who were about to be separated, so that the anxiety, even if they got separated, they could say, well, I've already started my own business on the side. Now, there are many companies who wouldn't want to invest in that, but it's one way to reduce the anxiety. And I think people who are treated that way are not only thankful, but those who survive respect the company for taking care of those who had to leave. We have two more questions, so I'm going to bump over to the first one. I'm a board member of a financial institution. What key questions should I be asking management in these times?
Well,
yeah.
I'm also a board member of a financial institution. I think the biggest issue with financial institutions right now are trying to come to grips with your estimated or expected credit losses. So really understanding the sectors, to where the softness is, what the likelihood of default is, what the magnitude of the default is versus what you have security against, and coming to grips with that expense and providing for that expense, as soon as possible.
Well, I think there are a couple of questions to ask. The easier ones are our risk management and control systems robust and in place, and have you checked them regularly to make sure that is so? But the other question is a more fundamental one. What are the risks that you haven't thought of yet that exist out there? In other words, the black swan events. And you have to search real hard to find them, but you can't. How many people thought a pandemic like this would sweep the world? Well, 99.9% of the population never thought of it, but there is 0.1% who have been concerned about this for years and warned us and actually put in place systems in some countries to protect against SARS and Ebola and other things that depressed or basically reverse the spread of those viruses. So it's a tough question, because how do you know what you don't know? But you have to keep on pressing to ask those questions in order to protect yourself in that regard. Also, it's human nature to try and avoid the toughest questions of all. You said, I don't even want to think about it. It's too painful. But those are the very questions we need to follow through to the end in that regard. But the advice I give is ask all the questions you think that are stupid, because most of the people around the table wanted to ask the same questions but were too afraid to ask. So there's no such thing as a stupid question. So you, as a non-executive director, ask those questions that seem naive and maybe even uninformed, because you'll be surprised what you learn from asking them.
Talk to the tourism sector, talk to leaders, and really find out, what are their pain points, what risks are they seeing, what's the outlook for their businesses like. And it'll tell you a great deal of how a financial institution that, is a partner in those businesses will be affected.
Kristine, the first part of your comment got cut off. All we heard was talk to your manufacturing, talk to your...
I was suggesting that talking to people outside of the financial institution, and leaders of industry in which, the financial institution is a partner. So, as I said, whether it's the tourism sector, the manufacturing sector, talking to people and leaders in those businesses and how they see the outlook of their businesses, because that's going to affect the institutions that lend to them.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, good point.
I don't like to rely only on what I hear in a boardroom. I like to do a little due diligence around town too.
Definitely. You're right. Thumbs up to that. I believe in that, Kristine.
Well,
Yeah, what I was saying before was, insisting that, asking the questions to the people in the room for sure in the boardroom, but ensuring that they're asking their teams those questions also. And they're doing the diligence in the organization to ensure that people in the organization are probing and understanding what can potentially go wrong. And those scenarios are being played through the organization. So ensure that there's an accountability that is being led from the leadership team throughout the organization, because that can only benefit in terms of ensuring all the ideas are brought to the table.
One other thing I want to say is, I think that how financial institutions deal with their clients in this unprecedented crisis is going to drive their brand and what they stand for and their loyalty and market share in the future. And so I would want to understand, how are customers being treated when their back is up against a wall? And how, coming out of this crisis, am I going to remember my financial institution as somebody who was there for me or somebody who left me stranded? And I think that will determine my desire to continue a business relationship with them after all this, dust is settled and things are good again, which they will be.
I'll add to what you're saying. That I wrote an article the other day about board members that were mailing in their participation on different boards, not financial institutions because they tend to be regulated, but many boards that I've done work with. And I would challenge board members to up their own game. That if they've been not coming to board meetings, not doing the things they need to do as board members, if they've been slack or loose or mailing in their participation, that they need to be the most engaged, the most intellectually rigorous, to use Graham's term. They need to be the most demanding of themselves, not the least, because the organization will only be as demanding of itself as they are of themselves. So I'm adamant about them and feisty and rude about them being the best that the organization has to offer, and they need to hold themselves to account at this new level if the organization is going to survive. But that's me and my face to this. All right, here's the questions are getting harder. I hate to tell you, but so I'm staying in this mode because they're only getting more. So here we have a question from Derek. If you knew 3 months in advance about COVID-19 and the socio-economic impacts, what would be the one primary thing you would do at your organization to adapt? Lord have mercy.
Who is that directed to?
All of you. Not me.
Okay. Well, I'll give one example, and it's actually in a school. So having retired, I'm a trustee of my alma mater, Wolmer's. As a group, we have been pushing very hard to get digital transformation, and it has been a long and slow process. There's actually a lot of resistance to it. So what we did, a group of us alumni got together and paid for 6 of the most senior people at the 3 schools, boys, girls, and prep school, to go to Atlanta for a week and to visit 11 schools to see how they've used digital transformation to improve learning and teaching. And it was an eye-opener. They came back as converts. And so as a result of that, from October of last year, we have been implementing a whole series of software systems, including Google Classroom. So when March 13th came, and the Prime Minister said, lock down all schools, we were much better prepared than most schools to actually teach and learn online. Now, we didn't know about it before, but what it is really saying is there are a lot of things we talk about doing, and we're taking a long time to do it. We need to do it faster and more immediately, because we don't know what the future will hold. And also events are unfolding much more rapidly than they did in the past. So the time to respond is much shorter.
Yeah. In my case, there are twofold. One is if I were to go back 4 months ago when I was leading Honeywell Industrial Safety at the time, which comprises of the PPE division. If I knew what I knew then I'd have built the 2 factories from before that made masks, N95 masks, instead of waiting until afterwards to build the factories. And at Stanley Black Decker, I would say that I probably would have turned the steering wheel even harder in terms of moving towards the adjacencies. We were in challenging end markets in terms of automotive, we still are, oil and gas, aerospace, and the move towards those adjacencies we did. And while it's only been 3 months, in retrospect, I'd have moved even faster because I think that the need to move with speed is as critical as ever, and doing it and getting the organization aligned to doing it and trained, generating that muscle is one that takes a bit of time. So turning the steering wheel even earlier and harder would have been something I have done.
Kristine, are we hearing you? I see that, yeah.
I think,
Great, go ahead.
yeah, you heard me. I think it just, I would probably have made the difficult decisions that we knew we had to make pre-COVID that just took too long to make. And COVID forces, in a lot of ways, COVID forced the iceberg, the water level to sort of decline and see more of the base of the iceberg. And I think that, I think back 3 years ago, and if I had a cost structure now, like if I had that cost structure that I have now 3 years ago, we'd have made so much more money that we would have been weathering the storm far more easily, So I think it's forced you to get really aggressive and really razor sharp.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sometimes we need these crises to really, get every little bit of fat out of the business.
Yeah, and maybe just to add another point, because Douglas mentioned earlier in terms of probably being more productive now than before, not having to go through traffic. And as I mentioned, I started 3 months ago and I haven't met anyone in my team face to face. And it's all to Zoom, all through Zoom. And I really firmly believe that I am actually more effective now than I would have been pre-COVID. So I think what has happened with COVID, it has really, certainly, it's cliche to say it's accelerated the transformation, but knowing what I know now, if I knew it 3 months ago, or even 6 months ago, driving organizations toward that, to take advantage of the technology in situations where it's just not productive to do otherwise, is something that I'd have really insisted on in a more systematic way.
And Graham, if I could just add to that, and also, really support a point you made, Douglas. I could say that as a working mother, and I'm sure we are all working parents, the work-life balance that working from home has allowed me to achieve is unbelievable. Versus being out of the home for 10 hours a day from morning to night and trying to keep in touch with what's happening at home, whereas you have children, coming and going and drop to an extracurricular activity, come home, finish a piece of work, pick back up. You're much more face-to-face and in touch with your children, I think, on a day-to-day basis, and that can only bring good. And I don't think the productivity in the workplace is suffering in any way. And I think that's good for society.
I would add to what you guys have said that I attended, or we facilitated our first retreat with a digital strategist, somebody who actually had the job of a digital strategist. That was a couple of years ago. And this fellow made a profound difference to the conversation that would have happened if he weren't there. And we started pressing boards and management teams to include someone who was digitally savvy. We didn't have much luck, frankly. The mindset was still, well, IT, and we have an IT manager and he fixes the laptops. And And that was the extent of their digital thinking up until I, I think that's changing now. But if it's one thing I would recommend is to hire someone or develop someone from the inside who has digitally strategic skills, who's thinking about the application of technologies in the future and is anticipating them and is helping the organization to accustom itself to what's going to come. Because it's a very, very strange, and well, it was a strange tool set for somebody to have. But now it seems like without that person, who knows what you do. And the last question that we have is actually tied into what Douglas said about the schools. And someone said, isn't it time, this is Sharon, isn't it time to introduce financial education and entrepreneurial skills into the basic curriculum of primary and high schools? They are not being adequately prepared for the real world in a timely manner. And boy, so I agree with that. I think our graduates, with the exception of Wilmers, right, Douglas?
Yes, that's correct.
Right? But our graduates are not leaving high school or even college for that matter with the kind of skills that they need to thrive in the times that we are currently in. And some of these entrepreneurial skills, like what's it called? The entrepreneurial program in high schools.
Well, there's a course called entrepreneurship. CAPE. It's at sixth form level.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the one you're referring to.
The name slips me, but the one I'm thinking of actually is it's an evening program where you start a company. Junior achievement. You actually start a company. You have a P&L, you have an accountant, you have a marketing person. You actually create a small company, and you actually sell a product or a service, and you generate revenue. But it's a hands-on entrepreneurial program. It's not in every school, I know, but I could imagine it making. I wish I had it. That's bottom line. I would have loved something like that when I was in school.
You know, Francis, I think anything we can do to encourage more entrepreneurship in young people is absolutely critical. And it's not just the skills, but it's seeing entrepreneurial role models, having guys go in and talk to them, and women that have been successful, you know, starting their own businesses or working in business. And that they see that there's a path to success that is not that is not, you know, less than desirable. I think there's and even just giving them the confidence that, look, this is possible and you can be that person too, is just absolutely critical.
Right. And on that note, we have about 6 minutes to 8, and our formal proceedings end at 8. But this is a good time for passing shots, last words of wisdom. The recording seems to be working, so this will probably all be recorded and rebroadcast. But do you guys have any passing last words of wisdom for those who will be listening in the future, or those who are currently on listening right now?
Well, I wanted to give the answer to the case, which is that we started 25 years ago and we are now at 2020. So how has Grace Kennedy actually done in terms of executing? Can I get 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So here are the outcomes for what we actually achieved. We doubled productivity by the year 2000. We made the target. So it's like people saying, "Oh, you're penguins. Penguins can't fly." And we were there waving at them and saying, "Oh yeah, that's what you think. Here we are up here, and we are flying." The next one is that we bought the Grace brand worldwide, and it gave us a tremendous platform to move forward in that regard. And by the way, I saw the question somebody asked about Grace products are expensive in Cleveland, Ohio. One of the things we did was very careful, detailed market research. And our market segment that we focus on are people who care about their families and their families' bodies and say, I am going to put the most wholesome food I can find and trust into my body and my family's body. That's a different segment from people who say, "Me just want something cheap to fill my belly," you know. So there are different market segments, and we need to be clear. We are clear whose unmet needs we're satisfying, and it's obviously worked in that regard. And maybe I should give you some figures on that. So I said our revenues in 1995 were 303 million US. 2019 there were 768 million. So that's more than double. Profit after tax was 10 million in 1996. Last year there were 33 million US. I'm giving it in US in order to take inflation in Jamaica out of it. And the one that is really the big surprise to most people, our market value, that is the value of our shares times the number of shares is 36 million US in 1996, $533 million in 2019. And the peer, so what, and remember this, Grace Kennedy has had a philosophy from its very inception to encourage all of our employees to buy shares in the company, and we have a very active stock grant and stock option scheme. So therefore, employees benefit not only by earning salaries and incentives, but also by being shareholders. So it has worked. And also, as an example, the Grace brand is exported to over 30 countries. We're hardly exporting in 1995, 96. Grace Kennedy Money Services represents Western Union in 11 countries in the Caribbean. So it shows we have expanded in a way that most people would have said was impossible 25 years ago. But there's one fundamental issue that I think is most important. The execution taking place now is not by me. It's by the younger generation who I was fortunate enough to help to groom, and then I stepped aside and let them move forward a decade ago. And they are the ones executing very successfully now in that regard. And at the same time, remembering and reinforcing the Grace Kennedy mantra even more effectively, which is honesty, integrity, and trust. Because once people believe that, then they want to buy your products and services and know you stand behind whatever you say. There's one final point I would make, and that is we developed from 1995 the direction to benchmark to the best companies in the world, not necessarily to our competitors in Jamaica, because we wanted to be up there with the best in the world. And it has proven to be a very powerful technique in that regard. So one of the things I encourage business people to do is to look outside, and the internet is incredible. We never had it in 1996. We had to do it with hard copy material or to travel overseas to get that information. Now we can get it in 30 or 60 seconds to see what similar companies are doing elsewhere in the world. And I do it all the time. And I tell you, one of the places I go to a lot, and that is Asia, to see what is happening in Asia, in India, Southeast Asia, because there's so much innovation taking place there. It's not necessarily looking to the US or the UK any longer to find best practices. Thank you.
Great. Kristine and Graham, do you have anything to add to those powerful closing words?
No, I just wanted to say that, as Caribbean people, we really need to figure out what industries we really can have a global competitive advantage. And I think they exist. And then we just need to drive value creation there and, take our region to the next level.
Absolutely.
And I'll just conclude by saying thank you. Thank you, Francis. And it's really been a pleasure for me to participate in the panel. I do a lot of speaking, but I never get to speak often with people from the Caribbean. So this has been a distinct pleasure and somewhat of an honor for me. I'll just conclude by how I started, which is, you know, our job as leaders is to do these two seemingly conflicting things at the same time, which is to determine how we reap the rewards and to drive near-term growth, yet at the same time plant the seeds for long-term growth. And it's not easy, but it is critical. And to keep the focus on doing both.
Great. So the evening is not over. Well, it's 8 o'clock and our formal proceedings are complete. We're actually going to be flipping over into networking mode where if you want participants to ask any of the presenters, they may stay around for a few more minutes and maybe they'll answer a few questions. It's 9 o'clock in Trinidad, so I know it's late for Kristine and it's late for Graham up in Connecticut. But if you can grab them to ask them a few questions, we'll be chatting and hanging around until at least 8:30 over there in um, conversation mode, or I'm going to share a screen, or networking mode. Just that when you go over, make sure to click at the bottom of the screen to turn on your camera and your microphone. And you'll just do that by clicking that red button at the bottom of your screen. So we'll flip over in a minute. Before we do that, I want to thank our presenters, our panelists for an awesome, stimulating evening. I could imagine easily going on for another, basically, because you guys are so resourceful, you're so smart, and you're so generous with your time. Frankly, you shocked me by saying yes to tonight because I didn't think my first choices would come through, but you were my first choices, and you all agreed so readily. You've just been amazing, and thanks for all of your help. On behalf of the participants, thank you for sharing the insides of your experiences, and thanks for being so honest and available to us. We really appreciate it. And I'm gonna stop the recording.